Did you know that your very favorite snacks, including microwave popcorn, protein bars, maybe the dairy-free milk alternative that you're using on almost a daily basis, could be significantly harming your gut health and therefore your whole body health? Hi, I'm Dr. Patricia Mills, and welcome to the Wild Wisdom Show. I'm a medical doctor with a root cause spin on health, and I'm here to take super complicated science and breaking it down into easy to understand information so that you can start acting right away to achieve your best health. And today we're going to be talking about how ultra processed food additives harm your gut microbiome health and your hormone balance. I wasn't even aware of the effect that ultra processed foods could have on your hormone balance until I dove really deep into the topic. In order to understand this conversation, you need to have at least a basic understanding of what is the gut microbiome. It is a community living inside of you, made up of bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoa, and living inside your gut. So from your mouth, your esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. And it has multiple functions in the body. When it's healthy, when the gut microbiome is healthy, it supports your health. And the multiple functions range from a direct effect on your gut health, like maintaining that healthy mucus lining that covers and coats your gut, all the way through to nutrition, making B vitamins, other essential nutrients. It helps in metabolism. It affects your blood sugar response to food. It helps with detoxification of heavy metals and medications and estrogen. It helps your immune system. It regulates inflammation. It has impacts on your pain pathways. It impacts your heart health, your brain health, your hormone health, your bone, your skin. It's actually quite intensely important. And so if you haven't heard of this yet, you might want to watch the last episode as well, called Gut Microbiome, Surprising Effects on Whole Body Health. And you can catch that on the Gut Health playlist on YouTube, or cover it that when they are harmed unknowingly through things that we do on a daily basis, it negatively affects our health. And our gut microbiome has been linked to health problems such as weight gain, hormone imbalances, skin irritations, diabetes, hypertension, stroke, heart attacks, that midsection weight gain that sometimes plagues us in middle age or even younger these days, depression, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, autoimmune disorders, even osteoporosis and osteoarthritis. It's all been linked to problems with the gut microbiome. And the reason for this is because when we kill the good guys in there, they can't do their function well. So we have lack of function in our body, and the space that is left by the good guys is then potentially occupied by some bad guys, some bad bacteria and viruses and fungi and protozoa. And it's not that they're bad, it's just that they don't have good functions and they can actually cause damage in our bodies. Stay tuned to the end, because I'm going to be showing you some things that you're probably having every day that are harming your gut microbiome and therefore predisposing you to future health problems, if not already contributing to ones that you're already experiencing. And that is the fact that one of the biggest killers of the gut microbiome are food additives that we find in ultra processed foods. I have here Brittany Williams. Hi, Brittany. She's interested in endometriosis and fibroids. And guess what? The gut microbiome is connected to the development of endometriosis and fibroids. So when you learn about the gut microbiome, as I'm teaching here today, you're actually going to learn information that will help you and anybody else on a journey with endometriosis and fibroids. And the reason for that is because the gut microbiome impacts our hormone production, for better or for worse. It also can create inflammation in the body when it's been harmed or when it's unhealthy due to things like these food additives. So yes, you must pay attention to this episode if you're experiencing any problems with hormones, endometriosis, fibroids, ovarian cysts, polycystic ovarian syndrome, infertility, problems with menopause. It really is important. And for me, it was one of the big game changers when I had my problems with hormones imbalances and how it was affecting my menstruation and menstrual pain and all those things. So definitely keep paying attention. This is for you. So what are ultra processed foods? Because when I got into this, I didn't think I was eating much ultra processed foods. And actually, boy, was I wrong, because it's hiding out in many of our daily foods that we've just become used to eating as part of the modern, mostly Western, but now global, and that Western way of eating is spreading. And some examples are mass-produced bread that's lasting on the shelf for longer than a week, bread that is not fresh and goes moldy within a few days. All of that kind of bread is ultra-processed by definition and has food additives. Crackers, cereals, breakfast cereals, highly ultra-processed foods with food additives. Dairy-free milk, so if you're having almond milk or soy milk or cashew milk or whatever have you milk, most of them, with few exceptions which I'll cover, have these harmful food additives. Protein bars, that's where I was going wrong. Protein powders, lots of food additives if you're not getting the right kind. Microwave popcorn, that was a big one in my life. Ice cream, unless it's freshly made with that fresh cow's cream or very clean coconut milk base, it's got lots of food additives. Carbonated drinks, those ones that have the flavors added in to taste good. Unfortunately, food additives, fruit flavored yogurts, and instant soups. Obviously, there's more that I'm not mentioning the ones that are obvious, like the chips and the junk food, right? This is more like the things that you might not have guessed had problematic food additives. So what are food additives? We have the classes of emulsifiers. These are the things that are added to preserve shelf life and provide some texture. Artificial sweeteners to help it taste better. Colorants, obviously to give the color, and preservatives to keep it lasting longer on the shelf. There are actually over 22 categories of food additives, and every country is different in terms of what it allows and doesn't allow. It depends on their risk tolerance for how much they think it's going to harm health versus support the economy by allowing the food additives and these foods to be made. So for example, in the European Union, around 1,500 kinds of additives are permitted at this point in time. More than 2,000 in China, more than 4,000 in the United States. So the United States has a very extensive list of permissible food additives. And I couldn't find the exact number in Canada. I do know that they allow about 15 categories of food additives, with many within those categories. There are natural versus artificial food additives. And what you have to understand is that the artificial food additives are very popular because they are more stable and they're cheaper and they're more predictable. They're more uniform. I see here Brittany is saying, I believe it. Yes, I believe that the gut microbiome could be connected to my endometriosis and fibroids and whatnot, right? So yes, thank you. I'm glad you believe it because some people actually don't. And I'm going to show you the science that proves that it does. So we're going to use an example to start off with. And this is the example of emulsifiers. And you find emulsifiers in over 90% of all packaged foods, including bread. So it could be a quote unquote healthy whole wheat bread, organic bread, even sprouted bread. But if it has these food additives, it is going to cause harm to your gut health. So finding that fresh sourdough bread, Ezekiel bread that you find in the freezer section, because it doesn't have preservatives, so it goes bad. So they have to keep it in the freezer section to keep it there longer. Finding those fresh breads is very important. And you can either have a natural emulsifier like lecithin, or you can have an artificial one like carboxymethylcellulose, or I'm going to call it CMC here for short. And again, it's found in around 90% of packaged foods. So why are these emulsifiers allowed? Let's look on CMC. It was approved in the 1960s for use in food concentrations up to 2% by regulatory agencies, including the US FDA and the European Commission. So why was it allowed, even though it hadn't been very studied? And the reason is because at the time, they knew that it wasn't very well absorbed into the body. So they said, well, if it stays in the gut and doesn't get into the human body, what kind of harm could it do? Well, at the time, they did not know about the gut microbiome and the potential harm that this could have on the gut microbiome and how harming the gut microbiome could harm our health. So since then, there's been a number of studies, and it started off with studies in animals, as it should. They started off in mice and chicken, and what they found was horrific. It caused metabolic syndrome, and if you don't know, it's that midsection weight gain, the abdominal weight gain, hypertension, high cholesterol, increasing blood sugars that puts you at risk for type 2 diabetes. It caused gut inflammation called colitis. In these animals, it actually caused gut inflammation, and gut inflammation is a root cause for inflammatory bowel disease, cancer, all the things I already listed have some element of gut inflammation involved. So it caused the good guys to die off, the bad guys to grow, and the gut microbiome to grow where it shouldn't in larger numbers. So there should not be a lot of gut microbiome in the small intestine. And when you have overgrowth there, it's called small intestinal bacterial or fungal, if it's a fungal overgrowth. And that can cause belly bloating, right? Very common problem. Cramping, diarrhea, constipation. So those can be early signs of gut microbiome dysfunction. And if you don't recognize and address it, then you can get all those long-term consequential effects. So that was one thing I was having, was the bloating with eating and constipation, right? Finally, in 2022 was the first study in humans where they gave CMC in what is called the randomized controlled trial type of study, which is the highest quality kind of study that can be done, where they take a group of people, they randomly put them into two different groups, give one group the CMC, the other group they didn't give the CMC. Otherwise, their diet was exactly the same, very well controlled, very high quality study. And they looked at what happened to the gut microbiome, and they even took biopsies, little pieces of tissue from the gut, to see what was happening with the gut itself. So they looked at them before the study, right after the study was done, and then followed them for 1 month and 3 months after. They took the stool samples, they took that biopsy. They had very, very fancy stool sample analysis, more than what your family doctor could order. They also looked at the blood tests, looked for inflammation. And what they found was that the group that was eating the CMC enhanced foods started to develop a mild belly pain with eating these foods. And when they looked at the gut microbiome, in the CMC group was a detectable decrease in the richness of the gut microbiome. So if your gut microbiome is like a tropical rainforest, there were trees and plants and animals dying within that rainforest. There was decreased richness of that gut microbiome. Okay? And decreased richness of the gut microbiome is a hallmark for all of those diseases that I mentioned before. All of them. All of them. Very important finding here. And specifically, there was a complete loss, a species loss of one type of organism called Prosnitzi. And that organism, that strain, is known to be very good for our health, and it actually helps make what are called short-chain fatty acids, or ketones, which are very popular these days with the ketogenic diet. And if you have a healthy gut microbiome, your body can make its own ketones out of the fiber that you eat. But if you kill it off with things like food additives, you can no longer make these healthy ketones, even if you eat tons of fiber or you have a ketogenic diet. So it's really important that you really continue to pay attention to what I'm talking to you about, because this matters. They found that these people eating the CMC had decreased healthy short-chain fatty acids, the ketones, and decreased essential amino acids, which are the building blocks for protein in our body. That was important. And they were very surprised to see that in 2 participants, in just 11 days of being given this, they started to see that the gut microbiome became so dysfunctional, so unhealthy, that it started to invade mucus that coats and protects our gut lining. And the thing is that if that were to continue, what we do know from other disease models is that it would then eat the mucus, invade the gut lining, cause gut inflammation, and even start to invade our tissues. A tissue invasion from the gut microbiome has been linked to things like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, ALS. Like, there's a lot of interesting links there. So we have this study showing that the CMC is bad. And then there was this big study that looked at various other emulsifiers, not just CMC, and found that the consuming foods that had these emulsifiers linked to specific health conditions in humans, like heart attacks and strokes, really specifically. And this study is called Food Additive Emulsifiers and Risk of Cardiovascular Disease in the NutriNet Santé cohort. So it's a big group of people, thousands of people. They analyzed how much ultra-processed foods they were having and specifically collected the data on all the different emulsifiers. And they actually looked at the different kinds of emulsifiers and which emulsifiers were more likely to cause an increased risk of heart attack and stroke. This was published in 2023. And they really drilled down on the very specific emulsifiers that were causing problems, and CMC was one of them. And there were many others. So this is real. Now, you would say, well, I'm eating organic ultra foods, like I have an organic milk dairy product that I love to have, and it must be good for me, and those things. Well, there are some emulsifiers that are commonly added to things like dairy-free milk products. And this one example is Carrageenan. And Carrageenan is also found in some processed meats, but it's primarily found in dairy alternatives. And now it has been linked to irritable bowel syndrome and gut inflammation. That's what the research is showing. You wouldn't know that you're having this. So if you're having this dairy-free milk and you're having it every day because you think it's healthy, right? Maybe you're trying to avoid dairy because you have a dairy sensitivity, or you think that a plant-based diet is better. So you're now having this daily dose, and little do you know, it's slowly but surely eroding your gut health, which then affects your hormone health, which can cause problems with, as you mentioned before, all of the hormonal things that can come out of that. Now, why is Carrageenan causing an issue? And it's interesting because there's this doctor, Joanne Tabachman. She's an associate professor of clinical medicine at the University of Illinois. She's done extensive research on Carrageenan, and she says that the structure of Carrageenan is so foreign to human cells that when we're exposed to it, it causes inflammation. And the problem is that when Carrageenan was allowed to be in our food supply, this was not known. And now it continues to be allowed in our food supply. Consumer Reports and the National Organic Standards Board actually called for removal of Carrageenan from organic products because of its questionable safety. But the US FDA said, no, we're going to continue to allow it, so that's interesting. So what about other food additives? There was a very interesting review in 2023 called The Impact of Food Additives on the Abundance and Composition of the Gut Microbiota. And they try to look at all of the research on food additives and gut microbiome health. And what they found were changes in the gut microbiome with preservatives like sodium benzoate, a very common preservative seen in many ultra-processed foods, sweeteners like Splenda, xylitol, and erythritol and sorbitol, caused changes in the gut microbiome. Sorry to say, this is really bad news for some people who really enjoy these artificial sweeteners. Colorants like the red 40 color, which gives the color red, and tartrazine did cause gut inflammation and it harmed the gut microbiome. Interestingly, these colorants in humans are known to cause hyperactive disorders in children, like ADHD. And there's been research showing that when they take a group of hyperactive ADHD children and remove food additives, including colorants, their symptoms go away or get better significantly. So this is big, right? Emulsifier polysorbate 80 and sugar maltodextrin also cause changes. This is important because, for example, polysorbate 80 is found in things like pickles. So if you buy the wrong kind of pickles, you could be buying pickles with really bad food additives. You want the fresh pickles that are simply pickled, like in brine. I had a really hard time finding good pickles. I did find one that had calcium chloride as the food additive, and I researched it and I did not find anything to prove that it is harmful. But I'm very mindful to keep the consumption of that low, and I try to make my own pickles or buy at the farmer's market, but there's sometimes when you just can't find it. So you try to choose the ones that have the least known harm to date and really minimize the use as much as possible. And here's one, ladies, and actually gentlemen as well, because just because a study was done in women, it doesn't mean that it's not applicable to men. But they did in 2023 do a very extensive research study looking at women who ate more ultra-processed foods. So they took a bunch of women, they did food diaries, they divided them into more ultra-processed foods versus less ultra-processed foods consumption, including those quote-unquote healthy protein bars. The ones who had more ultra-processed food consumptions had less healthy gut microbiomes compared to those who did not. But what I found fascinating was that these women who ate more ultra-processed foods had what was called more leptin resistance. What is leptin resistance? It's a hormonal imbalance that causes you to crave foods and gain weight. Yeah. And it had to do with effects in the gut affecting your hormone balance. So this is big because, sometimes we are at the mercy of food cravings and at the mercy of weight gain, and we don't understand why. Like, why am I gaining this weight? I'm eating healthy, I'm doing all these things, I'm investing in high quality organic and natural and whatever packaged foods, and here I am gaining weight and I'm craving food. And guess what? The reason could be these sneaky ultra-processed food additives. And for those who are interested, the study was called Differences in the Gut Microbiota of Women According to Ultra-Processed Food Consumption. So That's how it can directly and indirectly affect our hormone balance and directly and indirectly cause these conditions like endometriosis and fibroids, ovarian cysts, and those kinds of things. So I want to really highlight here that even quote unquote healthy ultra processed foods can potentially contain harmful additives. And I'm going to do a little show and tell here. So here is a brand that I generally really enjoy. It's called Elmhurst, and they make excellent dairy-free milk alternatives if you're someone who likes to add milk like products to your coffee or your tea or your oatmeal. And their regular milk, where it's just the regular almond milk or cashew milk, you look at the ingredient list and it's just water and the nut. That's it. But they came out with this almond barista edition, and I have to say that I'm not impressed. Because if you look at the ingredient list, yes, it's filtered water, almonds, rice, but then 2% or less of cane sugar and dipotassium phosphate, which is a food additive meant to make this taste smoother and creamier on the tongue compared to a regular almond milk, which is why it's called the barista edition. Not good. What can you use instead? You could use the non-barista version of their dairies, or maybe you're going to look for something like this. Here's a coconut milk by Earth's Choice Organic. It does not have guar gum, which is a food additive that for some people is irritating to the gut. And if you look at the ingredients, it's just organic coconut and water. Honestly, I don't even read anything about nutrition labels these days except for the ingredient list. I think it's that important. So, what about wine? Who here loves wine? I've got my hand up. I love wine. However, what I found is that, yes, every wine contains sulfites. When you ferment wine, it's a natural byproduct. So the small amount of sulfites in naturally fermented wine is normal. It's been around since the beginning of the history of winemaking. However, sulfites are now being added to certain wines as preservatives and enhancers. And they need to add more to white and rose wines because they have less antioxidants naturally than dry red wine. So to keep it fresher longer, to not have it go bad sooner, all companies will add sulfites to their wine, but those that do will add more to the white and the rose wines and less to the dry red wines. And what are sulfites? Well, when you're adding them in, it's a catch-all term for weird and wonderful chemicals like potassium bisulfate, potassium metabisulfite, sodium bisulfite, sulfur dioxide, the list goes on. What is interesting is that sulfites have been identified as one of the priority allergens in Canada. It's really fascinating to me how you could be having your nice organic red wine, and if it's coming from a company that's adding sulfites, it could be causing problems in your health. So we have to start getting curious. And honestly, when I came across this research, my decision now is I'm going to call the places where I'm buying wine from and ask them point blank, do you add sulfites to your wine? And if the answer is yes, I'm going to look for someone else. I mean, it's important. Here's a few other news flashes. Food additives have been identified as a key environmental factor in the development of inflammatory bowel disease. And it does so because of the impact on the gut microbiome. And the title says, Food additives, a key environmental factor in the development of IBD through gut dysbiosis. Gut dysbiosis is a medical term for problems with your gut microbiome where the bad guys are proliferating and the good guys are in lower numbers or in the wrong place. And this is important because in Canada, they released a report in 2023 that the rate of inflammatory bowel disease like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's is climbing drastically. And what's interesting is that I'm Brazilian by birth. And when I first came to Canada, in Brazil, inflammatory bowel disease was absent. In fact, it was so rare that internal medicine doctors were not trained in how to treat it, whereas in North America, it was becoming more and more common, so it was part of the medical training. So when you had a Brazilian medical doctor in training or a Brazilian doctor move to Canada, they actually had to go additional training in how to medically treat inflammatory bowel disease because they simply did not have enough exposure or the training in Brazil because it didn't happen there. And guess what? It's becoming more common in Brazil and other countries who are taking on our Western way of eating ultra-processed foods. And I remember when we moved from Brazil to Canada, it was like a status symbol to go from eating the whole foods to having these ultra-processed foods in our shelves. And unfortunately, what we're learning now is that it is not a status symbol. It is not an advancement in our evolution, it is not like positive evolutionary development that we are creating these ultra-processed foods that make things shelf-stable and convenient. Unfortunately, it is the massive setback in our development of chronic disease. And I'm not saying this lightly. Researchers in this field are all on the same page with that. Doctors who are not aware of this research would not agree, and it's simply because they're not aware of this research yet. So here's a few other studies that prove the point. So the impact of dietary fructose on gut permeability, microbiota, and abdominal adiposity by the midsection weight gain. This has been studied. One of the biggest sources of fructose is through high fructose corn syrup, which hides out in ultra-processed foods to give it flavor and sweetness. And there's even research showing that there's a potential for the ultra-processed food to affect our brain and behavior because of the connection between the gut microbiome and our brain. It's called the gut-brain axis, the microbiome gut-brain axis. And here's a study called Effects of Ultra-Processed Foods on the Microbiota Gut-Brain Axis, the bread and butter issue. Why is it called the bread and butter issue? Because a lot of these food additives are found in our ultra-processed bread and in non-real butter, so all the fake butters out there, even the vegetable oil butters, all of those. So the take-home message is start reading ingredient labels. I'm not talking about this label here that lists out the nutrition facts like fat, carbs, protein, sodium content. I'm talking about the actual ingredient list, and the ingredient list goes from the most abundant ingredient to the least. But what we're showing is that even in small amounts, these food additives, especially certain ones, can be very harmful. Start replacing those ultra-processed foods with minimally processed or unprocessed foods. So for example, there is some pasta sauce that is very good quality. It just has tomatoes, olive oil, salt, herbs. And then there's other ones that have the weirdest and most wonderful ingredients added in. If it's a chemical word that you do not recognize, until you become more familiar with which ones are okay, which ones are not, just stay away from it. One ingredient that you may not recognize that is relatively okay is called citric acid, which is a synthetic vitamin C. So some people are not so happy with that one either, but at least it's not as bad in terms of its chemical composition as others. And the other one is lactic acid. So lactic acid is a natural byproduct of fermentation. So as long as it's not added in really high amounts, it's relatively safer as far as what I can tell from what I'm reading in the research. Mostly everything else, just do your best to minimize it. And I know it's hard to go from zero to hero. Just choose a couple of things, especially the things that you're eating every day. So if you're drinking wine occasionally on the weekend, like a glass of wine here, or going to a restaurant having a glass of wine, I personally do that. I'm not going to go to a restaurant and ask the person there, like, excuse me, do you, is this added sulfite? Or, that's going to be annoying for yourself and for others around you. It's okay in the occasional quantity. It's the daily thing. So look at your protein bar, look at your protein powders, look at your favorite granola bars and breakfast cereals and what have you, and just start getting savvy on replacing those with whole foods. Have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, or night, depending on when you catch this. And please, if you enjoyed this, please save, share, subscribe. Definitely share. Sharing is caring, and you want more people in your life to become aware of this very important information. So I'll catch you next time. Bye now.